back to our video series, Old Testament Survey. In previous videos, we've covered an introduction to the entire Old Testament and then an overview of the Torah. We did Genesis, and last week we did Exodus, and so we're on to Leviticus. And so, John, I'll start by asking you this question. What is Leviticus about?
Well, very simply, I think Leviticus is about the holiness of God. What we've seen in the first two books, in Genesis and Exodus, is God creating a people, redeeming a people, and now at this point what we see is God calling a people to be holy because He is a holy God, to demonstrate His holiness in all the world. And the book of Leviticus is the set of instructions on, well, it's basically the set of instructions on how to be holy. and that's what He gives His people. And He gives His people those instructions in great detail, remarkably.
Okay. A lot of detail.
Yes.
In fact, sometimes as you're reading through, you wonder if the detail will end.
Yes.
It
can be hard to read.
Almost, I know, speaking for myself, I'm so spoiled in wanting to read things that are easier to read that it just almost becomes tedious. Leviticus begins with instructions for various kinds of sacrifices. Why did God demand so many different animal and grain sacrifices?
Well, let me start by saying that sacrifice is a way to worship God. In a sense, it still is. We bring ourselves as sacrifice. But in Leviticus, in particular, this holy God begins with how do you worship a holy God. And so He gives us various kinds of sacrifices. We could go into great detail about all the sacrifices and why and how. But let me give it to you in broad strokes. In general, there are two kinds of sacrifices that can be made, and there are two ways that you can make those. So the two kinds of sacrifice that you can make when you worship God from Leviticus are sin offerings and offerings of well-being. The sin offerings are the kind of sacrifices you'd make whenever you have committed a sin. And the offerings of well-being are the kind of sacrifice you would make whenever things are going well and you want to give thanks to God. And the two ways in which you can make those sacrifices are a burnt offering or a grain offering. In other words, you can make an offering of an animal sacrificed on the altar and burned, or you can make an offering of grain, that is flour or other choice grains that would essentially be baked. And so these are the two kinds of sacrifices and two ways you can sacrifice. Of course, there's more detail when you get into the calendar, the Day of Atonement, those kinds of things. But in general, that's the answer.
What would you say to someone who said, that just seems so brutal? So all these animal sacrifices and the blood and dividing the animals and it just seems brutal and awful. What would you say to someone who raised that?
I would say that it is brutal and awful. It is brutal and awful that animals have to die for these sacrifices. But what is even more brutal and awful, and this is what the sacrifices teach us, what's even more brutal and awful is our rebellion and sin against God. And so what the sacrifices teach us is that sin has a costly price. It was designed as a system to evoke in us emotion when we see that a lamb from our fold, a goat from our fold, has to be killed in order to make atonement for our sin. Now, does an animal dying replace or make my sin go away? Well, maybe not, you might make the argument, but here's what it does do. It makes us feel like we never want that to happen again when we see an animal that has to die for our sin. And so hopefully that emotional and evocative way that we worship God would change us. I think that's the intention. Now, it became a problem as the time went on and the sacrificial system became abused, and rather than having your own animal sacrificed there and having that emotional, evocative response, people would just pay. They'd give the priest money and they'd say, here, buy a cow on my behalf and sacrifice it. And so there became a distance between the emotional interaction with worship and what it was intended to be.
All right. Okay, what What is the difference between clean and unclean?
Well, the difference between clean and unclean is like the difference between holy and not holy. And there are a lot of things in Leviticus that will make you unclean. If you're reading through the book of Leviticus, you'll see that if you come in contact with anything dead, it makes you unclean. If you come in contact with anything that came in contact with anything that was dead, it makes you unclean. If you wear certain things, it makes you unclean. If you touch certain bodily fluids, any bodily fluids, it'll make you unclean. It seems like if you walk down the wrong side of the street, you become unclean. Yeah. And it can be overwhelming as you read through this, and that's kind of the point, to make us understand that there is a great distance between what God expects and what we're actually able to uphold and do. We're supposed to see in this system that we are unclean and desire a way to be brought back to God. It becomes this obstacle for us. Clean and unclean becomes an obstacle for us to coming to God.
That's something that struck me when I was reading Leviticus last week. It just seemed like, wow. I mean, every day you're unclean until the evening. Almost. Something happens and you're unclean. It leads me to the conclusion that Isaiah, I think he's referring to that when he says, we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags.
Yeah. Yep. But it also, it's like watching a movie when you see the hero of the movie who is going to save the victim or the other character in the movie. The hero is going to save them, but there's all these obstacles in the way, and you're thinking as you're watching this movie, man, I don't know how the hero's going to do it. I don't know how they're going to save him.
Right.
And this is what Leviticus does for us. It throws up all these obstacles and makes us wonder and anticipate, how's God going to bring us to Him? We're not clean.
Yeah, we're not worthy.
And so Leviticus makes us wonder, how are we going to get to God? Right. And of course, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but the anticipated response that we know as Christians is that Jesus becomes that way for us.
Okay. Is there any narrative in Leviticus?
Yes, there is. There is narrative, actually. In the 10th chapter, there's a story of Aaron's sons. Help me with their names again. I always forget them.
Nadab and Abihu.
Nadab and Abihu. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. Aaron's the high priest, and his sons are also priests like he is. And his sons go and offer a sacrifice to God that is not prescribed, that's not laid out. And it's called strange fire. That's put on the altar of the Lord. And because it is not prescribed, it's not the way that God wants to be worshipped, God kills them. Intense.
Wow. Yeah.
But again, let me remind you that this book, Leviticus, is a book about the holiness of God. Something that I think washes over on us sometimes, that God is holy, and not only is God holy, God is serious about His holiness. I mean, He goes to great lengths to describe what He expects for His holy people in Leviticus, and it's not to be trifled with. And this story in chapter 10 about Aaron's sons gives us an illustration of what happens when the holiness of God is trifled with. It can cost you your very life. This is a holy God, right. And He really means it.
Yeah, it's something that's interesting. My kids, kids nowadays throw around the word awesome all the time. Everything is awesome. But the word awesome, translated, I think sometimes can be translated awful. Yes. Full of awe. And I think there is an awfulness to the holiness of God in that it is not something to be trifled with. Okay, do all the laws in Leviticus still apply to us as Christians?
Man, that's a good question, and I think that's one that's asked so often, in chat rooms and conversations. This is always what comes up, well, you Christians, you don't observe this, and this in Leviticus, so you must not really believe the Bible, right?
Right.
Well, it's more complicated than that, but it's not so complicated that you can't understand it. So let me just describe a little bit. What we have in Leviticus are laws. Some of them are moral laws, and some of them are cultic laws. Remember, Leviticus is a book about the holiness of God, and so what He expects for His people is to be a demonstration of His holiness. Right. And He picks a particular people, a particular nation, a cultural nation to be the demonstration of his holiness. And in order to do that, he has to make them different than all the other nations. That's what the Hebrew word means. That's what the Hebrew word holy means. Kodesh, it means set apart, different, holy. So what God does is in Leviticus, he gives them rules about how to be holy, what to wear, what to eat, how to interact with each other. So that when all the other nations of the world look at the Israelites, what they'll say is, hey, they're being different than we are. They're dressing different than we are. They're eating different than we are. They're interacting with each other different than we are. And so God gives these cultural rules so that they would do that, and essentially so that they would be recognized as holy, as a different people. Well, what happens when Jesus comes? It changes things. When Jesus comes, he opens up the way for us to be the people of God. No longer do we have to be cultically or culturally Jewish. Instead, what we have is we become the people of God through faith in Jesus Christ. So, what happens with all the cultural cultic commands? Well, many of them go away because there's no longer a need to distinguish who's wearing what as God's people. You know, are you wearing blended fibers or not? Is that going to distinguish you as God's people? Well, no, your faith in Jesus Christ is going to distinguish you as God's person. Are you eating pork or not? Does that distinguish you? No, your faith in Jesus Christ distinguishes you as a person of God. However, there is also in Leviticus moral law that has to do with our responsibility to God and to each other. And sometimes there's overlap between cultic and moral law, and just because the cultic law goes away doesn't mean that the moral law does. I have a chart that illustrates this well. Let me bring that out.
Okay. All right.
You want to get Moses for us?
Bring the Moses bobblehead.
We've got Moses here.
Right.
And what you'll see on this chart on the far side there is the moral law. And what we have in moral law are things like we have one God. You shall have no other gods before me. And we would all say that that's still true, right? We have one God. We have other things like don't murder, don't steal, don't lie. These are all laws that we would say still applies to us. I don't know any Christian that would say that those things don't still apply to us, that we still have to uphold them. Yes, they're written in Leviticus. Yes, they still apply. They're moral law. There are some other things that don't necessarily apply to us because they're cultic law. So the things that had to do with the sacrifices, the sacrificial system, the dietary laws, those no longer apply to us. The clean and unclean things, those generally no longer apply to us because what they existed to distinguish the people of Israel from the other nations of the world. That was their only purpose, is to distinguish Israel from all the rest. Well, now Jesus has opened up the way to be God's people to all the rest. And so, effectively what happens is this goes away. So I'll just kind of, I don't know where my eraser went, but I'll erase it with my hand here. So see, there goes the cultic law. But keep in mind, there's still this area of overlap because there are some laws that overlap. For instance, there's in Leviticus laws about sexual relations. Those were, in a sense, cultic laws.
Right.
Because the nations of the world didn't have these sexual regulations. They were very effectively sexually hedonistic. And God didn't want his people to be that way. So he gave them these cultic sexual regulations on how to be holy and God's people. Well, when the cultic law goes away, do those sexual laws about sexual relations go away? No, because they're also moral. They're also laws that teach us about how we interact with each other.
John, what would you say to someone